Today we're going to talk about World War II on the Pacific side, the Asian front. That takes us to China and has us talk about Japan. One of the early areas that we need to mention is the Mukden incident. Remember, the Japanese had taken control over parts of China. We mentioned this earlier. And they justified it in many ways by, first they had taken over the area, and then as they were building the trains, then they claimed the Chinese had attacked the Japanese-built railroad, and this was a good excuse to move their troops in. They take Manchuria in 1931. So the Japanese came and began to build the train. The train was attacked, took over Manchuria, which is in the northeastern part of China, in September of 1931. Remember, we mentioned the League of Nations, which was formed after World War I, condemns this. But remember, the League of Nations, as we mentioned before, didn't have much power. So even though they condemned it, it didn't do a lot to hinder the Japanese progress in this area. In fact, to sort of justify it, the Japanese set up Henry Puyi, who was in fact, had been the last emperor of China. And when the Chinese Republic was started, he fled, and he fled to Japan. So actually the Japanese were claiming, hey, look, this is, the Japanese are liberating this and putting the emperor back in power. But of course the emperor was very weak and was a kind of puppet ruler for the Japanese. The Japanese will continue their expansion into the northern part of China. This is all happening before World War II in the 1930s, as we saw Germany beginning to expand in the 1930s in their territory. The Japanese are imperialistic and are doing the same thing, same kind of thing, in Asia, especially with China at first. The United States, remember, is not a part of the League of Nations, but they also do not recognize that the Japanese have a legitimate claim to Manchuria. But again, they don't do anything. They do not attack. They don't send troops to help or anything like that. They simply, I think they mentioned their displeasure. They threaten some economic sanctions and so forth. So here's a map then that shows the Japanese expansion prior to World War II. If you look at this map carefully, you'll see that the lightest shade of yellow here, Formosa, or Taiwan, the Japanese controlled that prior to 1931. Same with the Korean Peninsula. The Japanese had controlled that. Japanese had fought a war against the Russians, and they had taken these Kuril Islands out this way. They had territory up here, Karafuto. So they had all that territory. Then we see when they annex or set up a kind of puppet government in Manchuria, and they begin to move down into northern China all the way down to Beijing and so forth here. In 33, 37, and then also 37 in Shanghai, the Nanjing. So you can see they're really expanding their territory here long before World War II begins. So there's Mukden right there. So the relationship between China and Japan is obviously a tense one. In China itself, there are a lot of problems. We mentioned some of this in passing earlier. There are communist forces under Mao in the north. There is the leader, Sun Yat-sen, had died, and Chiang Kai-shek had taken control, who's trying to keep together this Chinese republic. And so since he had to deal with both the communists and the Japanese, he decides to appease the Japanese. They're up in Manchuria. And he wants to concentrate on the threat of the communists. Later on, of course, he does fight against the Japanese. This will become something which even the communists will join in on. But eventually, Chiang Kai-shek is pushed south, primarily by the communist forces, and eventually he is pushed south at first by the Japanese and later by the communists, and Japan is moving in on China, as I showed, down into Beijing in 1937. The Japanese set up a doctrine that some have called the Monroe Doctrine for Asia. Remember, the United States had the Monroe Doctrine for the Caribbean and South America that basically said other powers needed to stay out. The Japanese say a similar kind of thing in Asia, that the British, any of these other powers, the Dutch and so forth, the French, should stay out of Asia because Japan was going to watch over Asia and guide their neighbors to become more industrialized and so forth. Of course, a lot of people see this as just a precursor to a very large Japanese empire, which undoubtedly it was. Now, as you probably know, in World War II, Germany and Japan are on the same side. In other words, they're allies. Of course, they're different parts of the world. They team up in the late 1930s. They see that they have perhaps similar interests and similar enemies. Between them is the Soviet Union, the Japanese on one side, the Germans on the other. So Hitler was interested in this, I think the Japanese as well, to sort of keep the Soviet Union in check. If the Soviet Union were to attack Japan, then the Germans would attack them. If they were to attack Germany, then the Japanese were supposed to attack. So this was to be a kind of way to make Russia fight a two-front war. The idea was, of course, that later on they would both probably attack the Soviet Union from opposite sides in the two-front war. Now, the thing that really changed this, that we did mention in the last presentation, is that the Germans signed a non-aggression pact with Russia in 1939. This sort of leaves the Japanese hanging out there by themselves, and they have to start to question, well, what does this alliance with Germany mean if the Germans now have agreed not to have any aggression against the Russians? So that explains in part why the Japanese begin to move southward. Of course, they need natural resources as well. So then the Japanese believe they're going to have to face the Soviet Union by themselves because the Germans have sort of backed out of that. So they move south to get the resources they need. One of the things they need as they were becoming highly industrialized was oil. They needed oil. They needed rubber. They needed fuel supplies, this sort of thing. Rubber and tin. These are things they did not have in Japan. But they were nearby, relatively speaking. The Dutch East Indies, which we call Indonesia today, had oil, quite a bit of it. Down in Malaysia, what's called Malaysia today, they had rubber and tin. Here is how they obtained rubber. They would cut a tree, and then basically they would take out the sap, which in this case a rubber tree has this white sap, which they would then process into rubber. The other thing, of course, they needed is Japan has very little arable land, very little land that can be farmed, and they needed rice. They had a growing population. So they could get that in Indochina, which, of course, the French had controlled for many years, and Burma. So they were getting rice, oil, rubber, tin, all these things as they moved southward into Southeast Asia. So here's a map that shows the Japanese Empire in 1942. So this map can be quite instructive. The red areas were the areas which the Japanese controlled. We'd already highlighted how they had taken control, of course, of the area up here to the north from the Russians, and Korea and Formosa before 1931, then Manchuria, and then to move into northern China, and then some of the main harbors in the southern part of China. But then also French Indochina, Siam, which would be Thailand, Burma, Malaysia, which is Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, Formosa, which is Taiwan, New Guinea. Now notice their territory now borders India, Russia, and Australia to the south. Then notice all these islands they also had come to control by 1942. Wake Island, Marshall Island, Gilbert Islands, Guadalcanal, Guam, Okinawa, and so forth, Iwo Jima. These will all be names that become important in World War II because the United States, if it's going to defeat Japan, is going to have to move from each of these islands and take each area individually because of the way the Japanese control this area. That's going to prove to be difficult and bloody. A lot of Americans lose their lives in South Pacific. So, the United States and Japan then. The United States began to issue economic sanctions on Japan and told them they needed to return to the borders of 1931. They said, we're going to give you economic sanctions unless you return to the borders, the territory you had in 1931. Well, the Japanese are not going to do that. But the United States also said we're not going to sell you iron and some things like that they needed, steel, to build ships and so forth. The Japanese formulated a plan to, they didn't think the United States had the will to fight them, and they felt if they could knock out the Navy in the Pacific of the United States would just relinquish the Pacific to Japan. Of course, we know, in retrospect, they underestimated the will of the United States in this matter. So they devised a plan because basically the headquarters of the Pacific Fleet was centered on a territory, an island which the United States controlled, but was not a state. Of course, it's called Hawaii. And the Japanese, in a surprise attack, attacked Hawaii and especially Pearl Harbor in an effort to drive the United States out of the Pacific and basically have them, I guess maybe they imagined the United States would just sign some kind of treaty with Japan, say, okay, we give you the Pacific, we're going to stay out of the Pacific. Obviously, we know that didn't happen that way. But on December 7th, 1941, that was a Sunday morning, the Japanese attacked, in a surprise attack, the Pacific Fleet of the United States Navy, which was, most of it was in the harbor of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. So you see some of the pictures here. They hit the air bases, and they hit, of course, Pearl Harbor very heavily and knocked out the ships, much of the fleet there. Now, there were a few ships that were sailing when this happened, but our fleet was devastated by this attack. And then, of course, the Japanese quickly spread across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. But the Japanese, as we said, had underestimated the United States' will. Well, the United States was in a sort of isolationist mode. They didn't really want to do this. We enjoyed the League of Nations. We didn't really want to get involved in a European war. But this was seen as an attack on the United States because Hawaii was a U.S. territory. And of course, since you're devastating the U.S. Navy, you're killing lots of U.S. citizens as well. So this brought the United States into war against Japan. And then, surprisingly, Hitler immediately declares war on the United States as well. I think so that they can stop the shipment of goods from the United States to, or at least try to stop the goods shipping to Great Britain. So, the United States gets involved in this war very quickly in the early first half of December of 1941. Now, the United States, therefore, has a two-front war. See, by Germany doing this, meant the Japanese would not face the full force of the United States, and neither would the Germans. So, perhaps a strategic move on the Germans' part as well. I figured the United States was going to get into the war eventually, but let's just hit them right away. The United States was not geared up for this war, and it's going to take a bit of time for them to mobilize forces and to switch over production into military items. Here is now a diagram, a map of the U.S. fleet in Pearl Harbor at 7:55 a.m., December 7th, 1941. This is before the attack, which happens at approximately 8 o'clock in the morning, 8:01. There were two waves of the attack. So you see all the ships that are here. Some of them in dock, for maintenance. Some of them just stationed here. It was approaching Christmas. It's, Hawaii. It's a Sunday morning. And so really, they're not prepared. Many of them had been out late on Saturday night, and then this attack comes. So we see that many of these ships will be destroyed and sunk right in the harbor, which is going to make it difficult for other ships to get in and out. The route of the planes, the first wave comes at 7:55 a.m. The second wave about an hour later, 8:54 a.m. You can see the first wave, there are high-level bombers that are in yellow. In the blue, the dive bombers that come into the harbor itself. And they had practiced this ahead of time because Pearl Harbor is pretty shallow, so they had to really practice this so they could drop the torpedoes in such a way that they wouldn't just hit the bottom of the harbor and blow up, but would actually go into the targets of the ships. So those are the torpedo bombers, the dive bombers, and the high-level bombers. And then, of course, the fighter planes. These came in and hit the airfields, Hickam and Wheeler, and so forth. So going across the island of Oahu. This was devastating. It knocked out the airfields pretty much. It knocked out most of the Navy. This was a devastating two-wave attack early on that Sunday morning in 1941. So this brings the United States into the war. And this will be a turning point, obviously, in the war as well. So we turn our attention back to the European front of the war, now that the United States has entered the war. In December of 41, doesn't really start to get a lot of troops mobilized until the spring of 42. This means the United States forces are going to enter in Europe and, of course, begin to fight in the Pacific simultaneously. In 1942-43 in the European front, this is a real turning point. Things have been going well for Germany. They get stalled out in the Soviet Union. And now, very quickly after that, the U.S. is entering the war. The United States had already been supplying Great Britain with some supplies, although the isolationism of the United States, wanting to remain isolated, they didn't want to get too involved. But once we're in the war, we needed to find a way that we could help, say, the British forces primarily, because they were the only ones left that were active in Europe. And there were the Soviets as well. So the United States began a Lend-Lease program. Those countries didn't have enough money to pay us for the weapons that they needed, tanks and guns and ammunition and so forth. So this program was started, sort of the brainchild of Roosevelt, FDR, that we would lend this equipment and that the British would lease it, and then, later, say after the war, they would pay us back for this equipment. Now, part of the problem that the Allies have, and of course they have the Axis power of Japan and Germany and Italy, but then you have the Allies, the Allied powers, Great Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, and to some extent France, although they were mostly occupied and not able to be involved much in this part of the war. But in 1943, a very important point to remember is that the Allies had a meeting and they decided that the only way this war was going to end is if the enemies, that is, if the Axis powers, unconditionally surrendered. That's both the Japanese and the Germans. In other words, they couldn't come to the table and say, we want this, this, and this, and then we'll stop the war. They couldn't come to the table of anything. They just come to the table and surrender, and they just accept whatever happens. You see here a very important general for the Germans, a very effective general. His name is Erwin Rommel. Rommel is also sometimes called the Desert Fox because he was moving German troops across North Africa and in so trying to block the Allies, because the British had a stronghold in Egypt and some areas over there in the Middle East, and they wanted to make sure that the Germans took control of North Africa, which in large measure they did in what was called the Africa Corps. And in 1942, Hitler and the German forces take the Crimean Peninsula, which is in the Black Sea. So this is a good way to try to cut the Russians off of warm water ports to the south. So we're going to see then that North Africa will become a battlefield in the war. The Allies, the United States, Great Britain, will launch an attack into North Africa in 1942, 1943. It was very different fighting than the rest of Europe. Desert, very hot, so forth. But the Allied forces will eventually prevail and push Rommel back. Rommel is stopped in his progress in the summer of 1942, and then U.S. and British forces invade North Africa in the fall of 1942 and begin to push Rommel back. So by spring, by May of 1943, North Africa was under the control of the Allies. This was important and a strategic move for the Allies. Also remember that the Germans were stopped and defeated by the Russians in February of 1943 in Stalingrad. Named for the leader of Stalin, this became a real symbol for the Russians, for the Soviets, and they definitely stopped the Germans here. So we see for the first time Russian progress stopped. Stopped in February in the winter by the Russians. It stopped in the summer by mainly the British and the United States. And we start to see that the tide is turning in 1943. Now back to the Pacific Front. In 1942, remember Pearl Harbor was late 1941. Like I said, they're going to have to fight their way across the Pacific, that is the United States, and the Japanese are firmly entrenched in most of these islands out there. But the real important battle, turning point here, would be the Battle of Coral Sea in May of 1942. This is the first time the Japanese were stopped in their advance for more territory, and from this point forward, certainly looking back on it, from this point forward the Japanese are going to be trying to maintain their control over land, certainly not adding new land, and they are incrementally losing territory. In June 4th, 1942, another important battle, the Battle of Midway Island. This is significant because the Japanese, the real heart of the Navy in World War II, as it developed, were the aircraft carriers. You'd put an aircraft carrier, which is a large vessel, which planes and, of course, later jets could be launched from. They could circle, attack in the air, spot from the air. And so that became the center of the Navy, both the United States, Japan, and really all the navies. And it still is today, pretty much the center of the Navy. And it is then protected by destroyers and other battleships that are to protect the aircraft carrier, which becomes the center focus of the fleet. Well, in the Battle of Midway Island, June 4th, 1942, the U.S. Navy struck a heavy blow to the Japanese and destroyed all 4 of the Japanese aircraft carriers. The United States then began in the fall of 1942 of doing what is sometimes called island hopping, where our Navy and, of course, Marine forces, military forces, land, ground forces, would move from island to island, conquering each island, each stronghold, and sort of tightening a noose, if you want to think of it that way, moving in on all sort of boundaries, and pushing the Japanese northward towards Japan, and also westward to Japan, for the most part. But these are bloody battles. These are hard-fought battles because the Japanese are entrenched, the Japanese are dug in, and the Japanese also have a real devotion to their leader, Hirohito, the emperor. So they see this even as a religious act, not just a military act, not just a patriotic act, but in a sense a religious act of devotion. They would fight to the death. So that makes an enemy difficult to defeat if they're not concerned even about their own life. So we have the famous battle. Here's the famous image down in the lower left corner of the Marines lifting the American flag on the island of Iwo Jima after a very hard-fought battle there. So we see the tide begins to turn in late 42, summer 42 to 1943. And this diagram, as you can see, this sort of orange and yellow lines, and then all the battles that are marked. We can't go through all of them. Guadalcanal, for example, a big battle here. And moving, sort of pushing the Japanese back. And so you can see then in August of 42, the Marines land here. Here's Guadalcanal, and over here 43, and then they begin pushing the line in, and the U.S. And the Allied forces begin to tightening the noose, pushing them back out of New Guinea, pushing them away from Australia, and so forth. And you can see a list of many of the battles down here at the bottom. Now, if we go back to the European front, you'll see in 43, 44, late 43, 44, by May of 1943, the Allies, remember, in North Africa, and they decided to do something sort of in reverse. The Romans had invaded in the Punic War by going across Sicily and then into North Africa, Tunisia, Carthage. We're going to do the opposite. We're going to push from Carthage to Sicily and from Sicily to Italy and then move their way northward. The idea here is that Italy in the south was a soft underbelly of the Axis powers. And so Sicily and Italy became a real target here. And so Hitler had to push a lot of troops down this way. But it's a difficult push northward because the territory is mountainous, hilly, makes it easy for German gun emplacements to be up high and to lob shells down on the American troops. But they do eventually reach Rome in June of 1944. So here's a picture of a couple of U.S. troops searching through the rubble on Sicily looking for landmines. And so this is the way they did it back then. Now, really the attack on Italy and Sicily and Italy was a ruse. It was a deception to spread the German forces out. The main attack was going to come from England, an amphibious assault onto the shores of France, northern France. That's going to take place in June, on June 6th, 1944, a day that comes to be called D-Day. And this is the scene of the largest amphibious assault in recorded history. Eisenhower, Dwight D. Eisenhower, will lead the invasion of Normandy, the troops being staged in England and move across the English Channel and land in Normandy. In 3 months, it's a 3-month invasion, ships going back and forth. 2 million men and 2 million vehicles are landed from England in France. And from there, they'll begin to push their way through France and push towards Germany that way. While, of course, we still have forces down in Italy that are pushing, but the main assault's going to come through France. So here is a map showing you Normandy. The Allied forces landed over here in Normandy instead of in this area. This would have been closer. But the Germans were anticipating a potential landing here, and they had more heavily fortified this area. So the landing will come here in Normandy. With these beaches that become famous or infamous for a great amount of death. The ones where the U.S. forces primarily land are Utah Beach and Omaha Beach. The British forces on Gold Beach, the Canadians on Juno Beach, and the British on Sword Beach. Here this attack takes place. They have to fight their way from shore up the rugged coastline, and then from there move inland. They first landed paratroopers who were sort of dropped in behind the line, and then an amphibious assault that would come. From there, they would push southward through Normandy and then begin to push their way towards Paris and towards Germany. So then the push began to the Soviet Union. Also, the Soviet Union began to push from the west to the east, a coordinated attack with D-Day, while primarily American and British forces push from the west to the east. The idea was that they would create a two-front war for Germany, that they would meet somewhere in Germany, and they would defeat the German army. So, U.S. and Britain from the west, and of course the Soviets from the east. In March of 1945, the U.S. and British forces cross the Rhine River. And that is basically entering into German territory. You can see by April 30th of 1945, Hitler moves to a bunker. You see pictured here, the area where the bunker once was. The bunker's been destroyed. Hitler will move there and refuses to sort of accept defeat. Keeps sending out troops. He doesn't have any troops left, sending out really boys, teenagers, and even younger out into battle. Eventually, Hitler will commit suicide in his bunker, and that he'll leave others to surrender. It's on May 7th, 1945, then, that Germany surrenders in Europe, bringing an end to the European and German part of the war. Well, with the war over in Europe, also prior to the surrender of Germany in Europe, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, dies. His health had been failing. He had unprecedented long presidency. His vice president, who had just become his vice president in the past election, is thrust into the forefront. His name is Harry S. Truman. You see him pictured here. He's sworn in as president. The war in Europe ends pretty quickly, and now he is faced with what to do with fighting the Japanese, which the United States had pretty much been doing on their own, with some help from the Australians, primarily New Zealanders, not too much from the British themselves because they were occupied, but these British protectorates of territories. So FDR dies in April of 1945. Truman then is sworn in as president. Now, the United States had been developing a new weapon. This new weapon was a nuclear weapon, a nuclear bomb. Truman knew nothing of it. In fact, it was a top secret thing that Roosevelt and had been working on and keeping secret. This sort of changed the game in Truman's mind, because we then were creating a weapon, if we could perfect it, that would give us an advantage over the Japanese. They didn't have this kind of weapon. Because by everyone's calculation, for the United States to actually defeat the Japanese, it had been such a costly battle to fight from island to island to island the Japanese. they knew that the United States would lose many more soldiers moving to Japan, and then when we actually invaded Japan, that we would lose millions of soldiers. And of course a lot of Japanese would die as well, because the Japanese would never surrender because of their religious devotion to their emperor and to their country. At any rate, Truman learns about the weapon. It's not yet been tested and perfected, but it's out there. The Japanese, they know, will not surrender. So they knew the invasion of Japan would bring a major loss of life, both for U.S. citizens, weapon soldiers, and the Japanese. So he will eventually decide to use this new weapon to bring a quicker end to the war. And in his mind, a more humane end to the war, because less people would die. Now, of course, it's been a controversial decision. This, in fact, will be the only use ever of a nuclear weapon. It will be used by the United States, actually two weapons, two bombs, and it will actually bring an end to the war in the Pacific. So on August the 6th, 1945, the United States drops a nuclear bomb above Hiroshima, because that was thought to do more damage. It was make more of an impact. The Japanese still did not surrender. So on August the 9th, 1945, a second bomb is dropped on Nagasaki. This finally broke the Japanese, and they did surrender at that point in August of 1945. So here we see the bomb itself, what it looks like. By our measures today, a small bomb, 3 meters long, so that's a little over 3 yards. So about 10 feet long, roughly. 0.7 meter, so, not too big around, maybe about a foot. And then it's 4 metric tons of uranium, which equals the explosion power of 12.5 kilotons of TNT. As we said, the first one, a bomb or atomic bomb, dropped on Nagasaki August the 9th. The first one in Hiroshima, the second one in Nagasaki. And it was then on August the 14th that the Japanese surrender, not wanting to face another one of these weapons. We, in fact, didn't have another one ready. So it would have taken a while to get one ready. But nonetheless, the Japanese surrender. And World War II on the Pacific front is over. It's already over in Europe. Massive loss of life in World War II. Totals for World War II. Soldiers on all sides. Roughly 17 million soldiers die from, let's say, 1939 to 1945, roughly. So 6 years, or 5.5, 6 years. 17 million soldiers. Civilians harder to count. 18 million to 50 million civilians die because of the bombing, the carpet bombing, the fires, and so forth. The use of the atomic weapon. So 18 to 50 million die. And certainly World War II ushered in a new world order where you ended up with two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States, come out as leaders controlling the world. And this is going to set the stage for a Cold War eventually and the reign of the superpowers.